Hello. Welcome to our webinar, Critical Features of a Successful RTI Structure. Throughout today's presentation, we invite you to join the conversation by submitting your questions using the Q&A button at the top left of your screen. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dave Kiever, Regional Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. Mr. Kiever has worked in education for 20 years, including more than 15 years with Lindamood-Bell. He's engaged in professional development in over 30 states and 9 countries. Mr. Kiever holds a master's in education policy and planning from the George Washington University. Among other projects, he's provided a program evaluation to the Office of the State Superintendent of Education of a $2.5 million Race to the Top grant and designed and implemented a research study on the role of principals in the implementation of response to intervention reading programs in an urban school district. Mr. Kiever is a strong believer in public education and the proud father of 3 boys under age 8, the oldest 2 of whom are enrolled in DC public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Dave Kiever.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Mike. I appreciate that. And thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to hop onto the webinar. I know we've got a couple hundred people registered for the webinar, so we're excited to have all these folks on. It really is a privilege to get a chance to talk about our programs with such a large group of folks. And I'm hoping that you'll leave here today with, armed with some really good information that'll help you make some impactful changes to how you're delivering your reading instruction to students in your schools and districts. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right on in. Start off with our sort of agenda. We're going to talk about how this is the third and actually a series of webinars, and so I'll touch on what those previous webinars were because it's really good to kind of go through them. We'll be referencing them throughout the webinar itself, and then we'll talk a bit about the theory of tiered intervention and what we want to do when we're thinking about structuring tiered interventions. We'll talk about challenges to implementing any sort of tiered intervention, and then we'll finish up with the role of process-based instruction. So that's where we're headed to. So as I mentioned, this is the third in a series of webinars on implementing response to intervention, and the first one that we had was on assessments and grouping, which is a really crucial one because one of the primary reasons why a lot of intervention programs aren't successful has to do with not the proper assessments haven't been given to students to help determine where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then students are grouped in such a way that a teacher is having to differentiate far too broadly across that entire group of students. So assessments and grouping is a really good one to go back and look at. We also then talked about concept imagery and language comprehension. That's an important one as well. We discussed in there how a lot of comprehension instruction that's happening in schools is, frankly about strategies, and that they are compensatory strategies, and they're strategies that are put into place because students are have necessary in order for them to comprehend language. So here's the website that you can go and find those 2 previous webinars. Pretty soon this one will be up there as well, and then we'll be looking to continue to build off of that through the summer and into next school year. You can also find these webinars on the YouTubes. So there's that piece. And when we think about students and reading, and when we think about structuring a response to intervention process in our schools, we always want to start off with the basic understanding of what it is that's happening when students are learning how to read, right? Critically, if we're going to build anything, we need to be building it based off of an understanding of what are all of those necessary component pieces that allow students to be able to read. We know that students have got to have good phonemic awareness, so they've got to be able to come across a word on a page and figure out how to sound it out. They also, though, have got to have great word recognition. So if they sound out a word in one paragraph, they should be able to recognize that same word in the next paragraph. And these 2 are really the 2 decoding pieces, right? And if we're thinking about word at a time decoding, being able to sound out words, being able to recognize words. Also critical, though, to be a fluent reader, so somebody who's able to read quickly and fluently, is that we've got to have a well-developed vocabulary so that we can use contextual cues to help predict what that next word is going to be. And all of those pieces of reading feed into the overall whole of reading, which is comprehension, right? That there's no point in reading without comprehension, that reading without comprehension is not actually reading, it's just decoding, and that there are some students who do that. So I want you to try to picture these reading circles and hold on to them in your mind. I'm going to reference them several times in latter slides as we go through our discussion. The sensory cognitive functions that we talk about in those three circles are phonemic awareness, as I mentioned before. That's that ability to figure out the individual sounds within a word. So if I have a word like cat, my student can sound out at. They also have to be really adept at symbol imagery. Symbol imagery being the ability to picture the letters, right? So cat, if we're just thinking about the sounds, could actually be spelled with a K, right? But it's not. So I've got to be able to picture that it's spelled with a C and be able to hold on to that and recognize it quickly. And then I've got to have good concept imagery. And concept imagery, if we take that same word, think about our cat, pointy ears, long tail. Not sure what I drew at the end of his tail, but there you go. Those are the three different sensory cognitive functions and how they each play a role in terms of students being able to read. And those are really important when we think about how we should structure response to intervention. And quickly to touch on what the theory behind RtI is, it was posited as an alternative to using the discrepancy model for determining whether students should go into special education or not. And really, it varies by locale. There are some states that have 4 tiers to their response to intervention model. Some states have 3. Other states call it multi-tiered systems of support. Doesn't really matter what you call it. And other states don't define it really at all. Doesn't really matter what you call it. What's critical is that the commonality in all of them is that they envision that there are multiple layers of increasing intensity of instruction that occur before a student is referred to special education, right? And most of them are based off of that sort of triangle structure that you've probably seen before, right? And they theorize that in tier 1, 80% of our kids should be able to be successful in just getting their basic core reading instruction delivered to them that way. Percentage of kids are going to struggle, right? And in theory, that would be about 15% of kids that are struggling. Those kids are getting more targeted instruction within the classroom. And then in addition to that, about 5% of kids are continuing to struggle even in that situation. And so they move on to some intensive intervention that's typically delivered outside of the classroom. And that's sort of the perfect picture of what RtI would look like. And I'm sure a lot of you are probably out there thinking, well, that's not what my structure looks like at all, especially not that whole 80-15-5 thing. Got it. Totally get that that's not necessarily representative of what you're seeing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in some of the later slides. Okay. At Lindamood-Bell, we have structured our response to intervention model in the way that you sort of see laid out on the screen there. And foundationally, what we laid it out this way because we have that understanding of those reading circles, right? And so if we know that all of those pieces are necessary components of a student being a complete reader, then rather than assuming that those are going to develop, let's very intentionally and explicitly down in the regular tier 1 classroom, in addition to whatever their core reading program is, let's go ahead and do some explicit instruction in phonemic awareness and symbol imagery. So that would be Seeing Stars program. And in concept imagery, which would be visualizing and verbalizing program. And what that's going to allow to happen is that as those teachers are providing that differentiated instruction in the classroom, they're perceiving differences between their students. That starts to inform the stations that they want to run at tier 2. So rather than just saying, I'm going to do a whole bunch of stations, and we'll talk about that later, now I can begin to define what stations I want different kids to go to based on something. And as my kids continue to struggle, some of them, sure, are going to move on to tier 3 because they're going to need that sort of explicit intensive intervention. And I mentioned earlier the webinar on assessments. That's where that assessment and grouping becomes really crucial. I'm saying I'm going to pull my students out. It's not enough to just make it a small group, right? I now need to make sure that that group is as homogeneous in terms of their strengths and weaknesses as possible, so that when I give them 60 to 120 minutes a day of instruction for 80 to 120 hours over a course of a school year, I know that at the end of that, a lot of my students hopefully aren't going to require intervention any longer, right? And that is a lot of instructional time, and I know a lot of you are probably going, whoa, hang on, I can't match that right now. We're going to talk about why that's crucial. But that's an important number to hold on to, and if your students aren't getting that in terms of your intervention, it's important to understand that that's where they should be, or that's the amount of instruction we want them to be getting if they're an entire standard deviation below the norm, right? So we'll come back to that as well. When we think about implementation of RtI, we want to try to think about 3 variables that are really important to control for. Differentiated diagnosis, and I touched on that one a little bit, right? If I've got a first grade teacher who's got 30 students in front of her, she can be looking at those kids and understanding that they are different learners. They're going to learn in different ways. I've got to try to figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then I have to be able to apply differentiated instruction to them, right? So it's not just enough to recognize the differences. Once I recognize them, I have to have an appropriate response to those. And then to do both of those, I've got to control for environmental modifications, so changes that I need to make to my structure within a school or a district in order to help that be successful. And the first one that always jumps out at me is teacher capacity, right? When we think about teacher capacity, obviously, if we're saying, well, my teachers can't do this, so I'm going to buy them a super scripted program. Well, a super scripted program isn't going to be differentiated, right? So it's not going to meet the needs of your students already. Teachers can do this, right? But it's true what Louisa Moat said years ago, teaching reading is rocket science, right? So if we want our teachers to be able to go out and teach reading, then we need to arm them effectively with professional development, right? And this is something that Lindamood-Bell specializes in doing in schools. Not only can we do professional development, but we can also do embedded professional development, and that's where we're actually coming into a classroom with teachers and saying, hey, here's how you can do this with your students. We're modeling that step. We're providing feedback to the teacher. We're helping coach them on what it is that that looks like. And if we do that with our teachers, frankly, they can absolutely go out and own these programs and use these programs with their students and make those types of changes. We want to make sure that intervention is being provided intensively. And I think one of the biggest areas where this is a challenge is in thinking about what is driving how much instruction my students are getting. Is it the master schedule? Is the master schedule being driven by what my students' needs are, or is it being driven by something else, right? And when I mentioned that 80 to 120 hours, if the master schedule is being driven by my students' needs, then sure enough, we can find that 80 to 120 hours over the course of a school year, right? To make that kind of substantive change, of course, I've got to have some real buy-in from parents and from the community not just in the school, but the community outside of the school to help support that type of change. And of course, if we're talking about changes to master schedule and purchasing professional development, got to have leadership embracing that model. When all of those variables come together, when we're able to control for those, we can see a lot of success. And people have talked about the turnaround initiative as having not been a successful policy implementation. And I think in aggregate, perhaps that's true, but disaggregated, there were real pockets of success with those turnaround grants. And Haskin Elementary out in Colorado is one of those areas where we saw really dramatic change happen for kids. Haskin partnered through a school improvement grant with Lindamood-Bell to come in. At the time that we came in there, I think 27% of the third graders were reading at proficiency. So obviously they were at a huge level of need. It's a low socioeconomic status, high ELL population district. And by the time we come to the most recent battery of assessments, you can see what's happened in terms of the students meeting and exceeding expectations, especially as compared with the other school improvement grant schools across Colorado. Another way of looking at that is to say that what we want in the ideal setting is our students to move, or our school to move from turnaround to performance. And that we're able to do that in partnering with Haskin over that short time period. And that was fantastic. We saw exactly the types of changes that you'd like to have. What's most exciting to me is this latter section here, because in these first couple of years, Lindamood-Bell had a really significant role there implanted doing that embedded PD with that school, and then we began to pull back. And sure enough, Haskell was able to maintain that even after Lindamood-Bell left being there. And that's exciting because that obviously is showing that these changes can be sustained, and then the changes for students can continue over time. Right? So that's where we know we can get to. There are obviously a lot of challenges in terms of trying to get there, and those challenges are basic things. Referral rates are continuing to rise, and students aren't exiting intervention. Right? There's a lot of confusion at Tier 2, if any sort of Tier 2 instruction is even really happening. Right? And because there is confusion at Tier 2 and there is struggle there, there's a real lack of alignment across my tiers, and there's my RtI pyramid. There's a real lack of alignment across these tiers in terms of understanding what's happening with kids when they're struggling to read and what it is that we're trying to do as an organization to affect change for them. And other schools have just flat out got a hugely inverted triangle. So rather than the 80-15-5 that we talked about before, they're in a situation where the majority of their students need some form of intervention, right? So let's try to dive in and tackle these one at a time. So when we think about what's happening with kids as they're progressing from kindergarten through 12th grade, third grade is obviously a crucial year because this is the year where we're going to start to emphasize content-based instruction. Right? And content-based instruction is going to be the rule then from third grade on through 12th grade. Right? And third grade is also obviously where we start to do some of those statewide assessments. So we start to recognize that students, some of our students are really not being successful because they're not meeting proficiency on those statewide assessments. Well, third grade is where we discover it, but actually those gaps are occurring all the way back down at K1 and 2. We just haven't been aware of them or been providing explicit instruction so that we can help ameliorate those issues early on. Instead, our kids get to third grade, and the response often is that we send those kids off to special education. And special education, because again, the focus is on content, special education ends up doing compensatory strategies. So helping the kid get on to the next grade. And then the next grade, helping the kid to get on to the next grade. And that is very different than process-based instruction, right? Process-based instruction looks at it and says, my student's struggling with these underlying processes. Let me develop those processes so that they can access the content material. And really, we know that this is happening because when we look at sort of designations by disability type, the majority of students who are going into special ed are going in there with, ironically, what's called a specific learning disability, but actually isn't very specific at all. It's just that they don't know how to read, right? It's not like they're labeled as a student with autism or they have an emotional disturbance or a hearing impairment. They are just hitting third grade and now recognizing that they can't meet the content material. And so we need to do something with them. And what do? We put them into special ed. And that's really challenging because I think a lot of special ed teachers and a lot of administrators and other folks will say to you that oftentimes the classroom teacher knows more about how to teach reading than does the special ed teacher. And so if as a solution to the fact that they can't read, we're putting them in special ed, then we're really doing a disservice to that student and to us as an organization, right? So another issue that comes up is a lot of confusion at Tier 2, right? If we think back to those reading circles we talked about before, what I want to have happen is, and I think what all of us want to have happen, is that Tier 1 teachers is really looking at that core instructional program and saying, you know, I'm noticing differences between what my kids are doing. And so if I'm noticing weaknesses in phonemic awareness versus weaknesses in word recognition versus weaknesses in their vocabulary, I'm adjusting the stations I'm putting them into based on that. Instead, a lot of times, the rotation between stations is occurring in a classroom, but everybody's getting the same amount of time and they're just rotating around those stations. There's nothing that's changed about fundamentally what I'm trying to do with this student as compared with another student, right? And in part that happens because we haven't really established a real professional learning community within a school, right? And And a professional learning community needs to be based on the idea of there being communication, and communication across those tiers. And so that if I have at tier 1 a teacher who believes that whole language is the way to go about doing reading instruction, and at tier 3 I have an interventionist who is talking about it being all about phonemic awareness, then fundamentally those two teachers can't really have a conversation about what's going on with reading in their school, because they're coming at it from completely different perspectives. Even if they are, somewhat aligned, we have a good sense of what's going on as our students are moving from tier 1 to tier 3, right? We're saying students are at risk, the student's not being successful, let's get them into some intervention. The challenge, though, happens also in terms of how we move down those tiers, right? So if my tier 3 teacher does a great job with their student and they're doing fantastic, students making gains, I want to push them back into the classroom, but that language that the student's hearing back in the classroom is not consistent and it's not aligned with that, then oftentimes the students won't be successful when they go back into the classroom, despite all of the good work that's been occurring at tier 3, right? So again, I think that idea of understanding component pieces of what's happening when students are reading is crucial. Other schools have simply got an issue where, fundamentally things aren't working for them and they've got an entirely inverted triangle, and the bulk of their students need sort of tier 3 intervention. And I'm sure obviously most of you are out there and you're immediately identifying what the issue is. The issue is at tier 1, right? That those core instructional programs are not being successful for those kids. There are a lot of districts that are running into this type of challenge when they're thinking about English language learners. I've got a school district in Arkansas that's dealing with this. They've got a lot of kids coming to tier 3, and they're wondering, do these kids really need to be in tier 3, or is the issue primarily that we're not doing a good enough job at tier 1 in developing their English language skills so that they can be successful in those areas, right? So potential solutions, as we just talked about, re-examining tier 1 instruction to really ensure that those sensory cognitive functions of phonemic awareness, symbol imagery, and concept imagery are being explicitly and intentionally developed for kids. And then coming up with a consistent model for tier 2 with teachers as diagnosticians. And I think this is one of the things I love about working for Lindamood-Bell is that Pat Lindamood and Nancy Bell fundamentally believe in empowering teachers to go out and be the diagnosticians that are seeing students and recognizing what's happening with them. They're with them all the time. What we want to do is create experts, and we can create experts. We did that in Haskin. It wouldn't have been successful if those tier 1 teachers hadn't understood all of those component pieces of reading and been able to delve into those areas. And so we need to spend time doing professional development, acknowledging that our teachers are capable of doing this. What we need to do is arm them with the skills so that they can. And then we need to make sure that we're monitoring and increasing hours to an appropriate level at tier 3 so that our students will actually exit intervention, right? A lot of our kids can exit intervention. The issue is that they're not getting enough time. So I was recently talking with a school about how they've got some tier 3 kids in 5th grade. And the principal was saying to me, the 5th graders, they've been coming to intervention for a couple of years and they're not so excited about it anymore. And I want to make it fun for them. And obviously the research shows that learning needs to be fun and those things need to be aligned, and I'm all for that. But the question that jumped out to me, and probably did for you too, was to say, wait, why are these kids in intervention for multiple years? And when we went back and we examined how much instructional time the kids were getting, they were getting on average about 50 hours each of those school years before. So they weren't getting enough so that they exited intervention. If we can change the structure, get them enough intervention time, then they can exit intervention, and we don't have to worry about, is it fun for them? I think we can also think about that inverted triangle and say, if I'm not exiting kids from intervention and more kids are just coming in, then I'm really challenging myself, right? So yes, it's a challenge to change the structure so that I can get 80 to 120 hours. But if I don't get that, then I'm not going to exit kids. So when I get more kids coming in, I'm dealing still with a bigger and bigger issue, right? And then finally, I think utilizing summer school is something that Haskin did and something that a lot of schools are looking at doing. If you're saying to yourself, you know, in my structure, Dave, 80 to 120 hours just isn't going to happen. Right? I can't do it structurally right now. Okay, well, let's figure out where we can try to cobble together 80 to 120 hours. Well, if I've got 4 weeks of summer school has historically been about just making sure that students aren't falling backwards. Well, fundamentally, we can change that, and we can say, let's do intensive instruction with those kids 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, so that actually we could probably exit them from needing intervention by the start of the next school year. Well, now we've fundamentally changed the shape of that triangle that we're dealing with, and at the same time, I've gotten my students, or my teachers, a phenomenal amount of PD because they're able to see the scope and sequence of a program across what otherwise would be an entire school year for them to do. And now they're armed with that, they can take it right into their classroom. So when we think about those reading circles that we've discussed before, Seeing Stars is the program that addresses symbol imagery and phonemic awareness, and that is our decoding program. It can be used both in a tier 1 setting, a tier 2 setting, and a tier 3 setting, and actually is ideal when it's used in all of those, and you're simply changing the amount of instructional time and the grouping of those students. And then visualizing and verbalizing is our program to develop concept imagery, which is what underlies language comprehension. And I want to point out that we want to think about language comprehension as being both written language comprehension, but also oral language comprehension, right? That in fact, there are students who can decode just fine, but still can't comprehend. And that there are kids who can't decode at all, but could comprehend if you could read it to them, right? And so you want to be thinking about those contrasting students and trying to figure out, wow, those are different students. Well, how do I get them different instruction that fits their needs? Right? So next steps, you know, where do I kind of go from here? I think in terms of next steps, what I would be thinking about as a leader within my building is, well, how do I start to build that sort of common understanding among leadership? And by all means, you know, send them on this webinar, and maybe you can get them to sit down and watch this. But we're also more than happy to come, myself or my colleagues, and do either an overview, either virtually or on site, and try to figure out how we can help you problem solve some of the issues that you're coming across within your school or within your district, and whether these programs and our process is going to be a good match for that. And if we can help you change what those structures are. And then I think also just beginning some of that professional development process, right? We do workshops in which we come out to districts. If we're able to do that, I think that's dynamite. If we're not able to come to your district, we've got regional workshops across the country in which we talk not just about the theory that underlies the program, as I just went through, you know, hurriedly for you in about 20 minutes, but we actually go through what the steps of the programs look like and how you can implement those with your students. And so that was our big blast. There's our phone number for you to call us. And I think that we've got time. I haven't run us completely out. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. Mike, have you got any questions together?
I sure do, Dave. Thanks so much. We've got a few minutes just to answer some of the questions we've received. We may not have time to address all the questions during the segment, but our instructional experts will respond to everyone. So hang on. Our first question, Dave. What if all of our tiers need to be overhauled? Where do we start?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The $1 million question, right? I think that does go to that idea of an inverted pyramid, right? So if you need to overhaul all of your tiers of instruction, where are you going to begin? And I can understand the desire to look at it and say, let me triage tier 3 and try to make sure that I'm exiting some students from intervention. That could be one potential solution. I think ultimately, though, if you're in that situation, you're in that situation because what's happening at tier 1 is not successful. And so I think trying to fundamentally change what's happening there. And I'm not advocating that you necessarily say, well, let me take this core instructional program that we spent all this money in and did all this PD and bought all these materials and just throw it out and go get something else. Because then what you might find is after a couple of years, well, I'm not successful in this one. What we're advocating is, you know, there are some really good core instructional programs for reading. Let's supplement that with very intentional, explicit instruction and sensory cognitive functions to help make sure that we're getting our students to access those areas and we're developing those areas for them so that we can really jumpstart an entire restructuring of RTI in your building. Oops, can't hear you, Mike.
Sorry about that. We've got one more question here for you, Dave. I'm a reading interventionist at middle school and have students reading at a second grade level and want to use this, but I also have to work with my students on cell theory and Lord of the Flies. How much time should I focus on intervention versus providing support with their content areas?
Yeah, it's not an easy answer, and it might not be the easiest answer to give. I think that's the challenge. If you can picture back to that K through 12 pipeline that we talked about, the pressure is on, especially as you get to middle school, and it's even more when you get to high school, about content instruction. And oftentimes what we do is we help our kids with the content because we want them so badly to get onto that next grade level. And absolutely, I want them to get to the next grade level. The challenge is they get to the next grade level and they are dealing with the same challenge there. So we would advocate for doing process-based instruction over the content, right? That doing explicit instruction in those sensory cognitive processes develops independence for students, right? That's ultimately the goal, is not to catch them up to a grade level, it's to help them develop independence, then apply that to their content material so that they can ultimately get themselves back up to grade level and being successful. So trying to find a balance in between trying to say, let's take a break from content-based material because we could focus on doing it forever in a compensatory manner, or I can take a break and I can do process-based instruction with students and then help apply that over to the content material.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. That was fantastic. That's all the time we have for now. If you have further questions or would like to continue the conversation, please call us at 800-233-1819. Thank you for joining our webinar and have a great day.